Hi everyone, and welcome to our 11th and final video of Unit 3, America's Revolution in the Early Republic from 1754 to 1800. So in this video, we're focusing on our last two topics, 3.11 and 3.12, developing an American identity and movement in the early republic. So while we've been focusing a lot on politics lately, this video is actually really going to talk a little bit more about the social, cultural, and demographic changes that we're really starting to see in the early American nation. So first kind of main idea or question here is, what were the changes and continuities in American culture from 1754 to 1800? Okay, so we already talked a little bit about this. There were some changes for women. So women had a pretty limited political role, despite being pretty important for the American Revolution. Women were still considered crucial to this new republic, though, because of the concept of Republican motherhood. We already talked about this in class and in previous videos. But remember, the idea of Republican motherhood was the concept that women were in the best position to inculcate children with these Republican values, especially their male children, who in this new republic were seen as, participants in the political realm. Even common or more low-born children, male children, at least at this time, could and would grow up to participate in the government. So there's this increasing idea, really starts in 1787 with Benjamin Rush's essay on female education. This is increasing idea of Republican motherhood, that women have to be educated, not for themselves, but to be able to educate their sons. And this actually helps to increase some educational opportunities for women. Now, it is limited, right? It's limited to white women. It's not for Black women or American Indian women or people of color. So this really is kind of a limited idea. But we're starting to see some increases in female education in some limited ways. Additionally, thanks to westward migration and increased warfare, roles as diplomats and warriors for American Indians were increasingly important, and roles for American Indian women were starting to become diminished. So even in societies that we do not consider part of the mainstream of this new nation, even in American Indian societies, some women's roles were becoming more diminished because men's roles were becoming much more important as diplomats and warriors. Okay, so there are some changes for women across the board during this time period. In terms of art, architecture, and religion in this time period, so we're starting to see, look, art and literature and architecture is definitely going to reflect European ideals and standards. Okay, they're going to be influenced by European artists. Art was often, as it was common in this time, in the late 18th and early 19th century, art was often historical in nature with Enlightenment influence, themes of Enlightenment influence. Charles Willson Peale was a very famous portrait painter. He made a very famous portrait of George Washington, which you've probably seen. John Trumbull, another very famous painter, he depicted important historical events in this very romanticized way. In the next unit, we're going to talk a little bit about Romanticism as an art movement. John Trumbull helped actually to kind of provoke this nationalist fervor for these historical events, for depicting these historical events. Architecture tends to be classical revival style. Definitely influenced by Greek and Roman architecture. So we see a lot of brick and stone columns and domes. Thomas Jefferson's estate Monticello was very well known for this. In terms of literature, we're not going to get too far into literature. We'll talk more about that in Unit 4. But one thing that really did help shape American identity, and we've talked about this in small ways before, was Poor Richard's Almanac. That was an almanac written by Benjamin Franklin, and it was filled with aphorisms or sayings about life. And I know I've mentioned this in other videos and talked about it in class, but filled with these sayings, like fairly famous ones, like fish and visitors stink after 3 days, or early to bed, early to rise makes man healthy, wealthy, and wise. So this really helps to shape American identity, as Americans are those who are really industrious and hardworking, and this really falls in line with the idea that Americans are commoners, not nobility, that we don't have a noble class. We have a wealthy class, but not a nobility. So it really shapes the American identity in the world as, Americans are industrious and hardworking and kind of go-getters, and that sort of is shaped by Poor Richard's Almanac and other trends of the time. And finally, religion. So, late 18th century, Thomas Jefferson is actually going to have a lot to do with our sense of separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson helps write the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1786. This is before, you'll note, the Constitution, and before the actual creation, passage, and ratification of the Constitution. So the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom actually defines separation of church and state and will influence the Constitution in a few years. This definition says essentially that people can't be forced to go to a church or support a particular church with tax dollars. That can't be done. So it defines this separation between these two things. And this is very fundamental to the founding of the United States. Okay, and so here you can see a couple examples of what I was talking about, this portrait of George Washington I mentioned by Charles Willson Peale. Up here, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Again, this is a sort of romanticized version of this historical event by John Trumbull. And then over here, you can see a depiction for the time period of Monticello, where you can see those kind of Romanesque and classical columns and doming Jefferson's estate. Okay, so moving on to kind of talking a little bit more about 3.12. How and why did migration and immigration to and within North America cause competition and conflict? So, okay, let's start talking a little bit about westward migration. So remember the Northwest Ordinance, we talked about this, provided the mechanism for migration, settlement, and statehood. It created a mechanism for the sale of government land, adoption of Western territory as states, public education. It outlawed slavery in the new territory, in case you've forgotten what the Northwest Ordinance did. And honestly, though, this is going to help provoke conflict with American Indians, because this really does start to help open up more lands to settlement. Now, the Indian Intercourse Act of 1790 stated that the federal government was the one in control of the dealings with Native Americans. Individual settlers and state governments were not allowed to make treaties or deals with Native Americans over land and territorial dealings. But many American settlers just ignored these laws and treaties because remember, these Western areas, guys, this is at a time before there's easy instant communication. It takes a long time to get places. So these Western lands can take a really long time to reach. They're pretty isolated. So a lot of settlers would just sort of move where they wanted, especially in the Great Lakes region, and just kind of bank on the fact that there was really no authority of the American government there to tell them no. And of course, this is going to lead to disputes with Native Americans because this is a violation of many treaties. Okay, so Pan-Indian confederacies are nothing new, beginning way back when we were British colonies, but especially in like the mid 18th century, around the French and Indian War, many pan-Indian confederacies rose and fell, urging American Indians to resist the white man, to not become dependent on their ways. One of the most famous of which we discussed was Pontiac's Rebellion, which actually forced the British government to change their dealings and policies with American Indians. So unsurprisingly, 30 years later, when it's now an American government instead of British government, we're going to see another pan-Indian confederacy arising in that very same area, the Great Lakes region. And between 1791 and 1794, they scored quite a few victories, and including defeating 2 American government forces. So they actually have quite a bit of success. Now, that confederacy is ultimately going to be defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, but it is going to force, some of those early victories does force Washington to rethink Native American policy and roll back some of that aggression. So it does open the Ohio more to settlement, but we see less aggression from the American government for the next 2 decades or so. Ultimately, remember, British government had trading forts in the area, and those are going to start to close after the Revolution. That really accelerates, you may recall, after Jay's Treaty. Some Native American groups like the Shawnee and Cherokee are also going to migrate. They're going to move west across the Mississippi River, hoping to find lands that are free of American settlers, which will only work for a little while. Okay, population changes. So We do start to see, after the kind of interruption of the revolution, we start to see a continuing trickle of European migration, mostly in small numbers in those first years, 1790s, early 1800s. Migration is going to start to pick up more in the 19th century, and we'll talk about that in the next unit, along with industrialization. But there is, at this time, mostly a pretty small trickle of European migration. Enslaved Africans are brought until 1808, when the Constitution officially ended the slave trade. So that movement will stop as well. So mostly the population change, the gain in population was pretty much natural. And what was starting to happen was birth rates were starting to exceed death rates. Now, if you were in human geography a couple years ago, you may recall talking about the demographic transition model. And this would be America sort of entering stage 2 of the demographic transition model, where death rates start to drop because of better hygiene, better food supply, better medicine. Birth rates are still pretty high. So our population is going up. So farmers still need children to work, for example. So they're still having a lot of kids. So a lot of our population gains in this time period are really just from a natural population increase more than migration. Now, like I said, that's going to pick up a lot when we get closer to the middle of the 19th century, and we're going to talk more about that in the next unit. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about for this unit is the state of slavery. And this is going to kind of set the context for Unit 4, when we're really going to start to get into a lot of the conflicts over slavery. But just keep in mind, in this kind of new republic in the 1790s, a lot of people did oppose slavery. Northern states are going to continue to further restrict slavery, and there's a lot of different reasons for this. Some of it are moral in nature. Many of those arguments against slavery are actually economic in nature in northern states, and we'll talk more about that in the next unit. Some slave owners, like James Madison, for example, actually sort of hoped slavery would just sort of dry up and gradually fade away, as it sort of had in parts of Europe or parts of Latin America. But Eli Whitney's invention is really going to change all that. And you've probably heard of the cotton gin before, and Eli Whitney. We'll talk about him, like I said, again in the next unit. But you may already know that his invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s allows for very rapid separation and cleaning of raw cotton. And that increased the profitability of cotton production, which means there's a huge increase in demand for slaves to work cotton plantations in the South. So this is tied to the mechanization of the textile industry in England that occurred in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And again, we will talk more about this in the next unit. So the desire for slavery plantations in the West, new states opening up like Alabama and Mississippi, that's going to cause conflict with those who oppose slavery. A big theme in our next unit, in Unit 5, is going to be as America expands and gets larger and adds states, what do? Are those free states or those slave states? So that's going to be a big argument that we'll see unfolding over the next several decades. Some enslaved persons are going to escape slavery by reaching northern states, despite the fact that there was a fugitive clause in the Constitution that required fugitives to be returned. It wasn't really heavily enforced until a little bit later in the 19th century, which we will talk about. Some escaped to Canada or Florida or Indian territory to get away from slavery. And we also are going to start to see an interregional slave trade. Even though international slave trade is mostly stopped by 1808, the interregional slave trade does break up families, because at this point, enough enslaved peoples live in what is the United States that natural increases in their populations are happening as well, which leads to this really kind of terrible situation in which slave owners are breaking up families, selling children and wives and husbands away from each other for profit. So a lot of Chesapeake planters are selling their slaves to cotton planters as the tobacco market starts to decline and the cotton market begins to boom. And like I said, a lot of these issues are things we're going to discuss much more in the next unit. So this is it for Unit 3. Hope you liked it. We'll see you next time in Unit 4.